This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. It's a book club for lovers of the word made flesh, and it's Wednesday, October 18th, 2023. I'm Lee Bortons, and today we're also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Brittany Lewis. Jennifer, tell us about this month's shows.
Yeah, so I've missed some, but you guys have been discussing poetry, and I'll be here for the next few. So we've discussed The Brightest Heaven of Invention by Peter Lightheart and The Roar on the Other Side by Suzanne Clark. And today we are going to converse about Invitation to the Psalms by the Jacobson brothers. And then we're going to look at some art for our last week by looking at Marvelous to Behold.
Yeah, it's been just a really beautiful week or month of ideas. You can access all of our past episodes if you missed any on my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or you can go to my website, leebortons.com. You know what? I should spell it one time. It's Leigh-Bortins. I'm Lee like in Raleigh. Okay, so Jennifer, let's get started now that we told people where they can listen to our past episodes.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you the first question, which is always the same. So why is this book, Invitation to the Psalms, in the Classical Conversations curated curriculum?
So, this whole month's been so wonderful to me because what we've been talking about are the very books, the poetry of Challenge 3 and 4, that are the things that too many of our families miss because they get excited by other things to do as their children hit those community college years. And we just really want to encourage people to know that this is probably the last chance you're going to have to study Psalms as a Christian with Christians, being guided by people who just love God's word. Because generally poetry is not something our children go on to study in college unless they're actually English majors of some kind. So I wanted to read to you the description from classicalconversationsbooks.com. I thought it was really good. It says, imagine being able to fully immerse yourself in the captivating world of the Psalms. Invitation to the Psalms not only invites you to explore the grandeur and beauty of these sacred texts, but also equips you with the tools necessary to become a careful and attentive reader. This book delves into the dynamics of the biblical text, guides you through the complexities of Hebrew poetry, and uncovers the metaphorical world that lies within each psalm. And I think about now that I haven't been homeschooling for almost a decade, our children are all grown, our 4 boys, I still love the idea of poetry and wish I could read more with them. But grandchildren are a great thing, and when they're little, they love poetry. So I feel like all my knowledge on poetry, now that I worked it through with my own children, is actually coming to a place of great joy with my grandchildren. So hang in there. If you think poetry is unfamiliar or inaccessible, it's like anything else. It's when it's unfamiliar that you tend to not like it. And hopefully this podcast will encourage you to spend the time reading Invitation to the Psalms. And of course, the Psalms are the heart of poetry for a Christian. And they're the place where we actually get to slow down, because poetry is meant to be read out loud and slowly and really chewed on. And so this is that, again, another opportunity for our older students and challenge that they won't get elsewhere where they're rushed by deadlines. We give them enough time to really read these Psalms.
Yeah, I love that, Lee. And I was thinking as you were talking that someone had given me a small book of hardbound book of poetry, and it really was little. It was the original pocket size book, but it was like Most Loved Poems or something. And I read that to my children when I was pregnant with them to try to get them used to my voice, but also just to enjoy that idea of poetry aloud. So as more and more children came, they all got to hear the poems outside the womb as well. And then I loved what you said about just the attentiveness of reading poetry and savoring the sounds of the words. So not just the sights, but listening and really hearing the beauty in it. So
yeah, one of the things that I love about it is just the title, that it's an invitation, and the
Mhm.
authors are very clear to say that, look, we're discovering what's in these Psalms. We
Mhm.
are trying to know just enough to go, that's what that means, but not so much that you kind of brutally tear it apart. And then, of course, they're written for the novice, and so they're very engaging. There's even humor about the Psalms in the book. So I just think it's a great guide.
Yeah. And I'm glad you also use that word novice, or sometimes we talk about amateur here in CC, just being lovers of a thing. Poetry, every culture has had poetry, all of them. They haven't all had other art forms, but they've all had oral poetry. And so we sometimes forget that we are all able to join in that. And you're right when you say that those last couple of years in classical conversations is when our students, it's one of their last moments to really savor it. And I've enjoyed, we had a lot of whiteboards where I was last year at the church. And so we did poetry graffiti, and everyone just went up and as fast as they could copied their favorite poem from the week up there. And then we read them all aloud together. So there's some really sweet moments. And I've had one student who set every poems and psalms to music and played them for us on the guitar. So that's precious.
Well, saying music is just so important, because think about how many of our older teenagers, before they really do become young adults, are enamored by music and things of the culture, which they should be, because they know they're about to leave our home and they're trying to figure out their own stories and metaphors for life. And so it's just when they're interested in this style of thought is when we, of course, in classical conversations, being guided by tens of thousands of parents, put that into the curriculum, because we knew that if it's there, they could actually enjoy it and pay attention.
Yeah, that's good. I've enjoyed that over the years with them too. So Tim, we talked about poetry and Shakespeare already, and then a little bit about just forms in poetry and the nature of poetry itself and the craftsmanship when you guys talked about Roar on the Other Side. So we already touched on this idea that some people think it's either too abstract or it's dry and boring, but I know that you write poetry in your free moments, however many of those may be. So what inspires you when you write poems?
That's a hard question sometimes. The ancient Greeks believed in the muses that would have to be called upon to come and inspire the poet to write. And I get why they thought that, because there are times when I sit down to try to write and sort of stare at the page and have nothing to say. And even using some of those great tools that we looked at last time with the Suzanne Rhodes book, The Roar on the Other Side, even that might not overcome that sense of sort of writer's block or being uninspired. But I think it has something to do with contemplation, right? In both the reading of poetry and the writing of poetry, you have to be willing to sit with it for a while, either with the poem that you're reading or with the thing that you're going to write about as a poet. It takes looking at the details or considering the aspects of it, or what's just that perfect analogy or metaphor that you're looking for. And I don't think it can be forced. When you try and force it, either an interpretation or a composition, it comes off stilted or broken or something. And maybe that's part of the problem, is some poets either contemplate too little or they contemplate too long. And so they do create these abstract poems that don't really say much of anything that anyone else can understand. But poema, that Greek word, is the word for workmanship, and it takes labor both to read and to write it, but it should be that sort of labor that you enjoy. It should be a good, like, the satisfaction of working with your hands can sometimes be a great thing. I think poetry can work that way also. And once you've really come to that place of appreciation of the thing, that's when you can really start to launch into analysis or imitation in a good and profitable way.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned imitation. That's one way to get over this pitfall of thinking that we can't approach this lofty subject. I was outside last spring on a beautiful day and I was reading some poetry by Auden. And he doesn't normally write about dogs as his subject, but I stumbled across this poem about a faithful dog. It was sort of a, an elegy to the dog who had died. And my dog happened to be sitting under my chair outside. And I was like, I'm going to try to write my poem exactly like his, same rhyme scheme, all the same forms, but I'm going to write it about this little dog who's sitting underneath me. And it was probably one of the easier poems I've ever written, just because I think I was not stressed. I was just enjoying a beautiful day and a faithful dog at my feet and copying someone else. So anyway.
You're bringing up imitation. I want to remind people that if you're in our essentials curriculum, that's where we begin with Ben Franklin's idea of imitation. And in our structure and style program, we don't ask the children to be creative or original. We ask them to take paragraphs that are interesting and rewrite them. And that's the same thing that I find with poetry. I'm not like Tim, where I actually actively go after it, but I'm very intrigued by like witticisms and phrasery and almost rhetorical sound bites, trying to capture people's attention to Christendom. And so what I find I do is just like those children are doing in our curriculum is I'll take a phrase that someone says and I'll go, it's not quite right. And I'll try to tweak 2 or 3 words to make it either clearer or more from my point of view. So whether it's, the dog or what Tim does with his contemplation, or it's more practical like myself, there's all kinds of reasons poetry helps us just be better at phrasing our ideas and our thoughts. And we work on that starting with our 8-9-year-olds in classical conversations as an actual academics, but with the Copper Lodge series you wrote, Jennifer, and put together for us, you can start introducing poetry to your children when they're very young. We even have our Scribblers program, recipes for at home with your really little kids. So it's not that we only wait for challenge 3 and 4 for this opportunity, but it's at 3 and 4 where we look at these young adults and say, wow, you have really good things to say. And I'm glad we're helping you have tools.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And those resources you mentioned, like Scribblers and the Echoes books, help you just read some really simple poems out loud and enjoy them as a family. And then later those sounds do come back to you as you're working on your own compositions. So Brittany, before you return us to Invitation to the Psalms, I have to ask, are you also an amateur poet?
Amateur, emphasis on amateur. Yes. I do enjoy writing lines. I recently tried to imitate Homer. That was hilarious. But there is something about reading lovely words and examples that kind of build up our own storehouse of our imagination and tend to come out. And I think reading the Psalms do that. Scripture is so poetic, and reading great poets can really help us wield our words in a way that loves our neighbor better, that woos them to the truth, So I think it's valuable for anyone involved in any kind of, we all use our words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it's interesting. I want to say, because Brittany talked about just the reading aloud of it, the scriptures and the poetry. The reading aloud makes it so you hear things and you notice things that when you read, your eyes go too fast, but your ears are slower. And so whether it is scriptures or a poem or a dramatic play that's in meter, it's what a great community thing to do, to just read aloud to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brittany, I have to ask, what were you imitating about Homer? Do you want to share with us? That seems like a big project.
I was trying to summarize the beauty of challenge 4. And I was thinking about the end. Yeah, in his style. Because at the beginning of his poems, he often sings a song that is in praise of what happens at the end of the story. And I think that was a fun challenge to try and think about how Homer would have expressed those words. Sing muse of these wonderful poetic students that are graduating as leaders. I said it much shorter words than that, but I thought poetry is used to, it's something elevated about poetry that seems especially honoring to occasion. So I was thinking about the graduate and all those hours and days and years that parents invest in that image bearer, you know, and they're becoming so poetic themselves too. So just been a delight to me to watch students grow up and graduate
Nice.
and do things that we were praying that they would do, you know, and beyond what we could imagine that they would do.
Absolutely. That's lovely. Well, I haven't read your piece yet. I have seen it in my inbox, so I'll be excited to read your piece about Challenge 4. So, well, tell us a little bit about the Jacobsons who wrote this book, Invitation to the Psalms. Tell us about who they are and why they even wanted to do this thing.
Yeah, I loved their introduction. They include a little bit about themselves, but they are brothers. So that's interesting. They're 2 younger brothers. They have 2 older sisters to whom they dedicate this book, and even drop a last paragraph in the introduction, which I remember coming upon that. I thought surely I just assumed that these 2 men who were brothers had dedicated this to their wives. And I was so happy to see that they dedicated it to their older sisters in the last paragraph of the introduction. And they even give like a tease that sounds so much like our families, like, oh, by the way, mom loves us best though. You guys are great, but mom loves us best. So I think that's a good introduction to the spirit in which this is written, because they are merry souls. They're joyful Christians. They're also professors and ordained pastors teaching. And their goal for this book, they state, is to invite learners to come engage with the Psalms, as Lee had mentioned, to encounter them and to come as novices and amateurs. So that are not familiar with Hebrew poetry or the uniqueness of some of the qualities of Hebrew poetry that are different than what our Western minds often know just from our studies of poetry in school.
So I'm curious, you just described them as merry. You want to elaborate on that?
I think they're joyful. They have such a human reading of the Psalms. I think we might be tempted when we open the scripture to remember it's the inspired holy words of God that are living, sharper than 2-edged swords. But the way that they engage with the Psalms is from a very human, real reading. And they encourage us to use our own imaginations as we are engaging with those things, and to speak them out loud, and to hear and taste the words, those kinds of things. They also are very real about our struggles as humans, and weaknesses, and wrestlings, and getting angry about things, and injustice in the world or in our families. And they engage with those in a way that is, they're honest about the struggles, but they're also pointing us back, like the Psalms do, to the hope we have in Christ. So I think that's why they're so merry. Also, one of the men, Rolf, is a survivor of childhood cancer. And I was surprised to read that. He's a double amputee from the knees down. He loves to bike, and he's involved in a Lutheran bluegrass band, which has a pretty funny name. So listeners can go look that up.
I like that combination of bluegrass and poetry. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for filling us in, Brittany. That was good. I kind of want to meet them now. So
me too.
Yeah, maybe we can get them on sometime on the show. A lot of times people kind of see that we get out of context greeting cards. But why do you think it's important for us to dig into the Psalms ourselves and with our kids?
Can you guys hear me okay? Because it went funny for a little bit. Yeah. Okay, good.
I think, Jennifer, you should probably repeat the question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Was I breaking up? Okay.
Yeah, good.
So I just said we often sometimes get Psalms in snatches, like bits and pieces on a greeting card or at the end of a service. So why should we, as readers and with our students, dig into whole Psalms and really dive in? What do you think, Lee?
Yeah. So, I mean, we want our our own hearts to know the entire counsel of God, and we want to model that for our children. And so I want to read Psalm 1, the very introduction to all of the Psalms, because it sets us up for why we should read the whole Psalms. So please hear me here. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And I think about how we as classical educators are working so hard to preserve words and their definitions because we love God and his words. And the ungodly are losing their vocabulary. And so what a privilege for us to be able to meditate on his law day and night and do so in all the things that he's given to us. It's quite the blessing. So that's why you should do that.
Yeah. And I really like, I've always been drawn to the metaphors that are in Psalm 1. So everyone has seen a tree planted by streams of water. We get an immediate mental picture. And thinking of you here, Brittany, too, I've always wanted to write a Homeric epic simile. And so far, I've not been satisfied with any of my attempts, but I keep trying. But both of those things, both scripture and Homer's poetry, take those everyday things and connect them to us in a different way that allows us to see deeper truths. And so here we can think about ourselves as righteous people being planted and those streams of water going by. And that just is a beautiful image in that psalm. So, all right.
Well, I think it's time to thank our sponsor.
Yep.
Okay, thanks to classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the Classical Conversations book site, so you can purchase any of them. And next week, we'll be discussing Marvelous to Behold by Courtney Sanford. That book is going to be like just different than the other ones because it's going to be about art, or I should say fine art, versus we've been looking at word art these 3 weeks. And I think once again, we'll find beautiful words to go with the beautiful pictures. So I look forward to talking about it next week. All right, so Jennifer, let's get back to our words from the Psalms.
Yes, and as Tim shared with us, poema, meaning workmanship, that covers our visual arts too. So we're just going to expand our meaning for next week. All right, so Tim, let's do some close reading of a couple passages in the book. Can you read us the beginning of the introduction?
Yeah, this isn't quite the first paragraph, but very close. It's in the first page of the book. They write, "This book is meant more as an invitation to read the Psalms than as an analysis of what the Psalms say or mean. The Psalms are meant to be read. They are meant to be experienced. Analysis of poetry is helpful and important, but only if that analysis serves to assist the reader to enter into a psalm with greater sensitivity. Analysis is a servant. A competent reader analyzes poetry so that the poetry itself can speak more profoundly."
That's so hard sometimes with our older students. They often want to leap into analysis of things. So we've talked about this before, but if I take them to the art museum, they're very prone to start researching on their phones and writing rather than just looking at the paintings. And the same thing happens when we read Psalms or other poems. We're too busy trying to figure things out and not busy enough listening to and attending to the Psalm itself. So
yeah, analysis being a servant. When you were saying that about the art museum, it made me think about how we give a lot of our younger children in classical education, because of grammar, a lot of tools to help them get through the dialectic stage. And what can be really difficult is to know when to put the tools aside and, just like Tim said earlier, contemplate. And even if you say to them, contemplation is required, then you've just made it a tool and it can ruin it. So wisdom really becomes important in appreciating the poetry of this world.
Yeah, it's well said, Lee.
Mhm.
I think I feel the weight of this some as a parent, with my children to find that balance of exactly what you're pointing out, to help equip them and provoke in them questions and give them a framework to help understand what they're encountering in poetry or in art or in anything else, really. Um, but I wonder sometimes if in doing so I've done too much of that, or
Mm.
maybe not too much of that, but too little of other things. I've not helped them to find the balance between sitting and wondering and marveling and enjoying
Mhm.
things, and too quickly started to ask them to categorize or to parse or to analyze. So, uh, how do we help maintain that? Because little kids are actually pretty good at this. They don't ask
Mhm.
analytical questions. They just
Mhm.
like it or they don't like it, or they laugh at it or they're moved by it, but they don't analyze why, or why it's ineffective as a communication tool. How do we help keep them eh, able to do both things instead of sort of switching over from an appreciator or an experiencer to an analyzer and only the one thing?
One easy thing that helps us as homeschoolers is if we have a lot of kids at home, just read the poems or the Psalms aloud together. And then your younger kids will point out all the things that you were hoping your older kids would notice because they're still thinking about it. There is really some beauty in that, to use the metaphor of the one-room schoolhouse. There's beauty in having those varied ages. They do see differently. I'm also thinking I did poetry workshops this summer at classical conferences, and it was very interesting. You could tell everyone was nervous at first, and then all we did was read a children's poem aloud first. And I purposely chose a really simple children's poem, and that alone, I think, unlocked everyone and let them be a little free to listen to a little bit harder poems. And then I just had them go through and look at what adjectives do you see, what verbs do you see. And so we started to look at how one of my favorite books about poetry is called How Does a Poem Mean? Instead of what does it mean, how does it mean? And so just looking for staying on the surface of the images and the words made it less analytical and less fearful. So how about you, Brittany?
That reminds me of like coming to things as a little child and the wisdom in that. For me, I had the same struggle as Tim was describing. I think especially when I was a younger homeschool mom, I was worried that we wouldn't get to all the things that I wanted to get to. And the more I stayed in CC and the more I saw the path and the time for those things, it helped me relax and slow down. One thing my kids enjoyed was we had a tea and poetry time once a week, and we baked something delicious together and sat and read out loud, which you could do with the Psalms or anything. And that was lovely. It reminded me that I needed to slow down and take the time to just enjoy the words. I think Wes Callahan says in one of his videos on CC Connected about reading Homer that we need to read it out loud and taste the way the words I don't know. I'm going to use taste twice. Read it aloud so you can taste the words.
Nice metaphor too. Were you going to say something, Lee?
Yeah, well, the thing is, once again, is trying to make it approachable. So I remember when Robert and John were little, there was a series of books and it had this phrase in all the books. It was the little picture books. And it was anytime somebody in the book said me too, it ended with no, it's the book said me too, said Amanda. And she said it a lot. She was like the little 4-year-old tagging along. So for years, whenever somebody said me too, one of the three of us would say, said Amanda. People don't recognize that that's part of that poetry. It's just loving the words, and it reminds you of something you did that you enjoyed together. And so, my children are now grown adults in their 20s and 30s. And like 2 Christmases ago, my second and my youngest, so they're 12 years apart in age, enjoyed this movie, and they kept talking about the movie every time they got together because there was this phrase that they just kept saying at each other. So for Christmas, I got them business cards and t-shirts and things that went along with that phrase, just to show them that, look, you're not being homeschooled anymore, but your mom is paying attention to what you love. And I love that you love words.
That's great. Love it.
So good.
All right. Well, speaking of words, and I kind of jumped into this question a couple times by talking about metaphors in poetry. It's hard to talk about poems without talking about metaphors. So the Jacobsons give us some language, some metaphors in the introduction to help us imagine good ways to read poems and psalms. So Brittany, can you read that part to us?
Sure. They say to reduce a poem to its meaning or to summarize its message is to torture a confession out of it in order to find out what it really means. To read a psalm is, in Collins' marvelous language, to water ski across its surface, to press an ear against its hive, to hold it up to the light.
I like
This
those
reminds me of
metaphors.
this reminds me of T.S. Eliot when he read one of his poems are dense, and he was reading it to a crowd, and when he was all done, a woman raised her hand and said, "Could you explain to us what it really means?" And he responded, "Do you mean you want me to say it worse?"
I thought of
That's
that
great.
too when I was reading this. Lee, that story is so great. And doesn't he read it again? Does he read his poem again?
I don't remember the outcome.
I don't remember either.
That would have been a good answer.
Yeah.
Who's Collins? I don't remember.
He's Billy Collins, his poem Introduction to Poetry is right above this quote in the book on page 3.
Okay.
And those phrases are from Billy Collins, which I think he's a poet laureate of the United States.
Uh-huh.
He's still living.
I think you
isn't
could
he,
even
Brittany?
hear it. I think so. I think you
Yeah, I
can
think
even look it
so
up on
too.
YouTube and hear him read Introduction to Poetry himself, which is pretty cool.
That'd be beautiful. My great uncle is William Cullen Bryant, who used to be the poet laureate for the United States during the Civil War, and he actually owned the Saturday Post in New York City, and he was the man who introduced a new candidate for president, Abraham Lincoln. And so words are really important in our family's history. And for Emma and William's wedding gift this past year, one of our aunts bought an original first edition of William Cullen Bryant's works for them. And so that all by
Wow.
itself is just, our family loves words, and it's not a hard thing to love them.
Yeah. One of the things that my grandfather did when he was in his prisoner of war camp after the Bataan Death March was gather up poems that the men had composed, and he recorded them. And so we still have those.
You should publish that or get it out somehow.
I know we should. We found it. It's in the Library of Congress, but it's not published. So we do need to do that because their words were important, those poems they composed while they were in captivity.
Absolutely.
So how about you, Tim? What do you think about those metaphors? Water ski across the surface, press an ear against the hive, hold it up to the light.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit of the end of Abolition of Man with Lewis's discussion of science and analysis as things that eventually will destroy the thing that you're studying. And on the other side, it makes me think a little bit of like Jane Goodall, right? Sitting and watching the apes to learn about them. I wonder if there is something to that here with poetry, that rather than getting in and cutting it up and trying to count its feet and ascertain what lines rhyme with what other lines and giving them all stanza letters and things like that, if letting it speak and hearing it first, right, and then maybe those other things will come to you, and that's fine. But if you jump straight to that other piece, it's like dissection, right, where you're cutting it all up and examining its parts, but you really lose the beauty of the whole. And that experience, you can't right? You can't press your ear against the hive to hear what's going on there if you've already smoked out the bees and chopped it up.
Yeah, if you can delight in them first, then sometimes those the analysis excuse me, the analysis really can be a servant. And I'll give an example. I went to Emily Dickinson's home this summer, and I have long been an admirer of her poems. And I think I would have told you they weren't very metrical. I don't know. It would not have occurred to me to scan her poems like some other poems, but I've memorized many of them and have enjoyed them over the years. And the docent at the museum pointed out that she used hymn meter because she was, she was a good New England Protestant. And so she used hymn meters to write her poems. And ever since then, I have really been delighting in the sounds. But I think had I counted syllables first, I would have missed that. It was important for me to know them first and then find that out later.
Good.
So, well, good. All right. So later on in the book, the Jacobsons kind of look at what they call strange sorts of songs. That's a very compelling title, Strange Songs. And so in that section, they aren't looking at Psalms, but they're looking at the prophets, Amos and Isaiah, and kind of looking at their sarcasm. So understanding these prophetic critiques, this is what they write. Understanding these prophetic critiques would have required the prophets' ancient audiences to recognize the forms of these songs, a dirge and a love song, and then to realize that the forms were being sung sarcastically. So what do you think of those audiences would have thought about? I mean, I don't know that we've been talking about lots of beauty today. I don't think we've talked about sarcasm. So what do you guys think?
Well, first, just define for our audience, a dirge is usually a funeral song, correct?
Yep. Yep.
Versus a love song. So that reminds me of Shakespeare, tragedy and comedy, a funeral and wedding.
Yeah. And it reminds me especially of Claudius's first speech in Hamlet, where he talks about those things being all mixed up, that there's sorrow at the wedding and joy at the funeral, because they've gotten married too soon after the husband's death, and it's unnatural to have those things mixed up.
Well, maybe that's an appropriate time to be sarcastic, is to point out the unnaturalness.
Yeah. I think so. I think sarcasm usually is used to wake us up to things that are wrong, don't you think? So what do you guys think about their audiences here, Tim?
Yeah. And maybe goes right back to what you were just saying about Emily Dickinson and the hymn meter in her poetry. That I don't know that the ancient audiences would have looked at those and said, well, let me analyze that and see whether that's a love song or a funeral dirge. They would have been sort of an intuitive thing, right? It was something that they would have just have absorbed by the culture that they lived in. And so it would have been jarring to them. It would have been strange. We hear it sometimes, right, where we have words that don't match the musical style in a song that we have. I don't know that we do it very often in poetry, in modern poetry, right? Meter doesn't necessarily carry meaning of its own. It only carries the words along. With a few exceptions, and I think the limerick is one. It's really hard to write a limerick that doesn't sound sort of fun and bouncy. And so if you write serious words in limerick form, there's something off about it. And I think that that's what's going on here. It's harder for us to get that because we don't have these forms that are as universal in our poetry as they did in theirs.
Yeah, and because we aren't of that culture, I don't think I would know when to recognize which was sarcastic or which was bouncy or any of those things without some book like the Invitation to the Psalms, where they've really done the research to teach me. So another good reason to read through this book. And then find out how merry the Jacobsons are. That was so exciting, Brittany.
I know, and how much they honor their sisters. They're just winning lots of points today. I have to say, they seem like
Seriously.
lovely people.
Yes.
So it's probably about time for us to look at our last quote. Lee, do you want to read us this one? And it's again about metaphor and simile. So,
okay, here we go. This particular metaphor of shepherd may be difficult for some to imagine for themselves. Shepherding is no longer one of the top 5 professions, probably because there's not a lot of room for advancement, at least not in the Western world. The particular metaphor may take some imagination for us to understand and apprehend for ourselves, particularly if this means that we are the sheep. The shepherd imagery has retained a great deal of its strength and can still fire the imagination of the reader if care is taken. God is not only a shepherd in the Psalms, God is also rock, light, fortress, redeemer, and many other things.
what do you get out of that passage, Brittany?
I was just thinking about how kind the Lord is to appeal to our imaginations and to use the psalmist to do that. I remember when I was young, a pastor or a teacher explaining how dumb sheep were and how what was required of a shepherd. And I knew that a shepherd, a good shepherd, would lay down his life as David did when he was shepherding from that story. But I didn't know just how dumb sheep were and how prone to repeat behavior that was harmful to them and how much they needed saving. And so I remember my littlest, she came to the Lord through a great story. It was a dramatized story. And at one point, I remember so vividly being in the car with her, and she started, I think she was 3 or 4. She started saying, "Mom, I'm the lost sheep. I'm the sheep. I'm the lost sheep. Jesus saved me." And it was I will never forget that. And she will never forget that. And I've given her little sheep in one form or another to remind us that we were God's sheep. So I just think it's so kind of the Lord to use words like that to appeal to our imaginations.
That's a really good story.
Yeah. And the shepherds had to care for their external threats of the sheep, like, well, there were a couple of kinds of external threats, predators, and then their own stupid behavior, as you described, Brittany, literally walking off cliffs and or eating things that they shouldn't, or
drinking water.
Also, yes. And also they have a lot of, you have to care for their hooves and they twist their stomachs. There's a lot of health, and just thinking about that recently made me think more about how God cares for us in all those ways too.
It's nice too, because like they say, there's a number of metaphors about God. He doesn't just give us the one, but he gives us myriad metaphors, right? That he's a rock, he's a fortress, and he's a shield, and he's a portion, and he's an inheritance, and and no one of those things is sufficient, right? No matter how much you explore that one metaphor, it's never enough to understand God. But it is a way to start to understand something about God, and that's a kindness of him to reveal himself to us that way.
Yeah. Yes, and then you do what the psalmist did. You write it down, all those things that you've learned about who he is.
Well, we talked about journaling last week, so that's a good tie-in. And next week we can talk more about getting pen to paper and talk about drawing. So thanks, team, for being here, and let's keep the conversation going. We'll see everybody next week.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.